In 1964, the United States Department of the Interior sent a report to Washington declaring that the Chicago Federal Building was architecturally significant, structurally sound, and, their words, capable of serving a useful purpose for many years. The General Services Administration read the report, filed it, and ordered the building demolished. Within 18 months, 120,000 tons of granite, marble, gilded bronze, and mosaic tile were rubble. The dome that had stood 297 feet above Dearborn Street, a dome wider than the one on the United States Capitol, was gone. Nothing like it has been built in Chicago before or since. The building that replaced it is a glass box. To understand why, you have to go back to 1894 to a Chicago bursting at its seams. The city had just hosted the world's Columbian Exposition, and the population was exploding. The Post Office Department alone employed 998 clerks and 935 mail carriers, and the federal building they all worked in, an 1880 structure on the same block, was sinking into the mud. Its foundation was failing. Congress declared it dangerous. On February 13, 1895, President Grover Cleveland signed a bill appropriating $4 million to tear it down and build something new in its place. $4 million in 1895. Congress hired a special architect for the job and spent an additional $25,000 just to retain him. His name was Henry Ives Cobb. He was 40 years old, already one of the most prolific architects in the Midwest, a man who had designed the master plan for the University of Chicago campus, the Newberry Library, the Chicago Historical Society, and the Fisheries Building at the World's Fair. He married well. He moved fast. He had designed more important buildings in Chicago by the age of 35 than most architects complete in a lifetime. The federal building would be his largest commission, and, as it turned out, his most controversial. Cobb drew up plans for a building that occupied an entire city block, bounded by Dearborn Street, Adams Street, Clark Street, and Jackson Boulevard. The footprint of the basement and first two floors measured 321 feet by 361 feet. The floor plan above that was a Greek cross. 4 massive wings radiating from a central point, each wing 6 stories tall, sitting on a 2-story base with a raised basement. At the crossing of the 4 wings, a dome. Inside the dome, 8 additional floors of office space stacked within the drum, bringing the total to 16 stories. The exterior was sheathed in 500,000 square feet of gray granite quarried from Mount Waldo, Maine. The dome was covered in gilt glass tiles that caught the light of the lake. The dome, that was the thing. The 4 wings of the Greek cross met underneath it to form an octagonal rotunda, open from the ground floor all the way to the 9th story, roughly 300 feet of vertical interior space. The rotunda was 100 feet in diameter, which meant it was wider than the rotunda of the Capitol building in Washington. Cobb had modeled it on the architecture of Imperial Rome. More than $2 million, half the building's original budget, went into the interior finishes alone. Polished granite, white marble from Vermont, sienna marble from Italy, mosaic tile floors, gilded bronze fixtures, oak doors with brass hardware that had U.S. molded into every doorknob. The courtrooms were paneled in mahogany, and at the very top of the dome, Cobb placed a trompe-l'oeil painting, a false oculus, an eye open to a painted sky where white clouds drifted perpetually across a field of blue. Look up inside that dome, and you would see an Illinois sky that never rained. Construction was slow. Government policy at the time required that Congress appropriate funds for each contract individually as it was awarded. There was no general contractor. Over 100 separate contracts were let during the 7 years of building. Foundation work began in August 1897. Wooden piles driven 72 feet below street level into the soft Chicago clay, and was completed in September 1898 at a cost of $208,000. On April 30th, 1898, the superstructure contract went to John Pierce, a New York builder, who submitted a bid of $1,897,000. On October 9, 1899, Chicago Day, the anniversary of the Great Fire, President William McKinley arrived by horse-drawn carriage to lay the cornerstone. He came hatless. The crowd that lined Dearborn Street let out what a newspaper account called salvos of cheers and shouts. McKinley would be dead within 2 years, shot at another World's Fair in Buffalo. But on that afternoon in 1899, he pressed mortar over a stone that was supposed to anchor something permanent. Even before construction was finished, the building had enemies. Chicago's postmaster, Washington Heasing, had been one of the loudest voices demanding a new federal building in the first place, and then refused to endorse Cobb's plans for the postal section. In a friendly but emphatic letter, Heasing listed his objections to the layout. The mail handling floors were, in his view, badly arranged. The driveway for mail wagons was too steep. The sorting rooms were in the wrong place. Cobb had designed a monument. Heasing needed a machine. The building opened in 1905 regardless. The post office occupied the basement and the first 2 floors. Federal courts filled the upper wings: the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. The Civil Service Commission, the Railway Mail Service, and the Weather Bureau took the floors inside the dome. Other agencies filled whatever space remained. The exterior was clad in granite that weighed collectively enough to bring the building's total mass to roughly 120,000 tons, all of it resting on 50-foot wooden piles sunk deep into soft Chicago clay. By 1907, it was already crowded. The postmaster who succeeded Heasing, a man named F. Coyne, told the Chicago Tribune the day after the post office opened that the brand-new $5 million building was, already, a poor makeshift. The driveway was so steep that mules couldn't haul mail wagons up it without blocks placed behind the wheels. Sad-eyed mules, the Tribune noted, and 2 horses. Coyne said he wasn't complaining. He'd done that 3 years earlier. He was doing his best to get along in quarters that were, as he put it, inadequate and badly arranged. His own office, he conceded, was spacious and luxurious. That problem, a building that was grand where grandeur didn't matter and cramped where function did, would follow it for 60 years. But the dome didn't care about efficiency. The dome was a room you walked into and forgot what you were there to do. Postal workers crossed the mosaic floors of the rotunda every day on their way to sort mail. Lawyers passed through on their way to argue federal cases. Clerks and bureaucrats shared the space with civilians buying stamps. It was the largest enclosed public interior in the city. Not a museum, not a concert hall, just a government lobby where you could look straight up and see 9 stories of granite columns, carved balustrades, and that painted sky. The interior details were everywhere. Terracotta accents, scagliola columns imitating rare stone, marble sourced from Tennessee and Vermont and Maine and Italy, laid into corridor floors and wainscoting and stairways. The elevator doors were ornamental cast iron, copper-plated. Every brass doorknob in the building bore the initials of the country it served. The building was, in the language of its era, a cathedral of governance. It said that the business of the federal government was worth doing in a room worth entering. Whether the government agreed was another question. The post office remained cramped. The courts remained overburdened. The agencies kept requesting more space, and the building responded by being beautiful, which was not the answer anyone was looking for. On September 4, 1918, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a man walked into the Adams Street entrance of the building carrying a cigar box. A woman who had just purchased war stamps noticed a piece of string dangling from beneath the lid. She watched the man touch the burning end of his cigar to the string, drop the box to the floor, kick it beneath a radiator near the entrance, and walk out. The blast killed 4 people. Edwin Colcow, a postal worker and Civil War veteran. William Wheeler, another postal worker. Joseph Ladd, a sailor. Ella Mielke, a civilian standing on the Adams Street steps. 75 more were injured. Windows blew out of the Marquette building across the street. Flames and dust filled the rotunda. A 17-year-old substitute mail carrier had been walking through the lobby just minutes before. He had just finished sorting his route and was headed for the exit. The same Adams Street exit. He later recalled the moment in a 1956 interview. He was in the lobby when the concussion shook the building, dust shooting out from the direction he'd been walking. The bomb killed a man who worked 2 desks from his. The 17-year-old's name was Walt Disney. He had been working at the post office since July. He would leave in September to join the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. A decade later, the world met Mickey Mouse. No one was ever convicted for the bombing. Authorities suspected the industrial workers of the world. Big Bill Haywood himself had been upstairs in the building that afternoon, meeting with representatives of the Court of Appeals about his sentence under the Espionage Act. But no charges stuck. The building was repaired, its foundation held. 13 years later, in October 1931, the building hosted its most famous trial. Al Capone, the head of the most profitable criminal organization of the Prohibition era, the man behind the Valentine's Day Massacre, stood in a 6th-floor courtroom paneled in mahogany under the jurisdiction of Judge James Wilkerson. Federal investigator Frank Wilson had spent years building the case, following the money instead of the bodies. The government's strategy was methodical and plain. Capone had earned income and had not paid taxes on it. Wilkerson, suspecting the jury had been tampered with, swapped the entire jury pool with one from another courtroom at the last minute. On October 17th, Capone was convicted of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison and fined $50,000. The courtroom where it happened was 200 feet below that painted sky. The trial of Jimmy Hoffa would follow in later years. The building accumulated history the way its dome accumulated light. Not by trying, just by being the place where things happened. Through the 1930s and 1940s, the building carried on. The post office kept growing. The courts kept hearing cases. The agencies kept multiplying. And the building kept not being big enough. The foundation, those wooden piles driven 72 feet into the earth, had begun to settle unevenly. Portions of the building had sunk. Floors that were once level now tilted slightly. It was not structural failure. The building was not going to collapse, but it was the kind of slow, creeping problem that gave bureaucrats ammunition. Every crack in the plaster, every stuck door, every overflowing mailroom was further evidence that the building was past its useful life. Meanwhile, the world outside the building was changing. After the Second World War, the federal government expanded into every corner of American life. New agencies, new programs, new mandates. The number of federal employees in Chicago grew, and the old building couldn't absorb them. Offices spilled out of the federal building and into rented space across the loop. By the late 1950s, more than 30 federal agencies were scattered in separate locations around downtown. Coordination was difficult. Commutes between offices wasted hours. The government was paying commercial rents when it could be paying itself. By the late 1950s, the federal government's offices in Chicago were scattered across more than 30 locations around the loop. The old federal building was straining under its own obsolescence, not because the walls were failing, not because the dome was cracking, but because the government had outgrown it. The floor plan that had seemed expansive in 1905 was now a maze of corridors leading to offices that were too small, too dark, too far from one another. A Chicago Tribune writer described the building as a granite octopus doomed by the loop of progress. In 1959, the government announced that the building would be replaced. Mayor Richard J. Daley supported the plan. It was framed as urban renewal, a necessary step in the modernization of downtown Chicago, a city whose loop was losing tenants and tax revenue to the suburbs. The federal government's investment would anchor the south end of the district. The commission went to Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, the German-born architect who had fled Nazi Germany, settled in Chicago, redesigned the Illinois Institute of Technology campus, and become arguably the most influential architect in the world. His philosophy was 4 words long: less is more. Mies was 73 years old when he received the commission. He had spent 3 decades refining a single idea: that a building's structure should be its ornament, that glass and steel could achieve a dignity that carved stone merely imitated. He proposed a complex of 3 buildings: a courthouse, a federal office tower, and a post office, arranged around an open granite plaza. Clean lines, steel frames, glass curtain walls, no dome, no mosaic, no mahogany, no painted sky. The new complex would consolidate those 30 scattered agencies under 3 roofs and would contain 3 million square feet of office space, roughly 7 times the floor area of the building it replaced. Congress authorized the project in 1960. The cost was estimated at $105 million. The General Services Administration selected 3 firms: Schmidt, Garden, and Erickson, C.F., Murphy Associates, and Mies van der Rohe as design architect to carry it out. There was a condition. The old federal building had to stay open while the first new building went up. The GSA dictated that the courtrooms in the Cobb building remain operational until the new Dirksen courthouse across the street was finished. So the old building sat on its block while its replacement rose on the adjacent one, the 2 structures coexisting for a few years like a sentence half rewritten. The ornate clause and the spare one standing side by side, visible from every angle along Dearborn Street. The dome of one, the flat roof of the other, granite and glass, separated by asphalt. Mies's team designed the courthouse around 28-foot structural bays, a modular grid that would govern every element of all 3 buildings: every column, every light fixture, every bench, every door, every paver. The Dirksen Courthouse was completed in 1964. Federal workers and judges moved across the street. The courtrooms went dark in the old building. The last case was heard. The mahogany was empty. Then the Department of the Interior sent its report: architecturally significant, structurally sound, capable of serving a useful purpose for many years. The GSA demolished it anyway. Demolition began in April 1965. The building had stood for 60 years. The dome came down. The Corinthian columns that had lined the upper porticos were pulled from the facade. The rotunda floor, that mosaic of marble and colored tile, was broken apart. The painted sky above the rotunda was open to the real sky for the first time, and then it was nothing. Over 100 separate contracts had built the building. It took far fewer to take it apart. But someone was paying attention. Members of the newly founded Chicago Architecture Foundation, an organization that barely existed yet, managed to salvage 2 of the building's massive Corinthian columns during demolition. The columns were 40 feet tall, carved from granite. They were pulled from the wreckage and placed in storage. They would stay there for years, with no clear plan for what to do with them. At some point in the 1980s, they were submerged near the Lake Michigan shoreline to help reinforce a breakwater. 2 40-foot granite columns from one of Chicago's most decorated interiors sitting in lake water, doing the work of rocks. In 1996, 31 years after the building fell, the Chicago Park District retrieved them. Richard A. Block, the co-founder of H&R Block, had survived what his doctors called terminal lung cancer. His foundation funded cancer survivors' gardens across the country, and when the foundation offered one to Chicago, the designers incorporated the 2 salvaged columns into the entrance of the garden in Grant Park, at Randolph Street and Harbor Drive. The columns stand there now, 40 feet of carved granite framing a steel arch, aligned on axis with the Corinthian columns of the Field Museum to the south. 2 columns. Out of a building that filled an entire city block. The Kluczynski Federal Building was completed in 1974, 9 years after demolition began on the Cobb Building. It stands 42 stories tall, 562 feet, at 230 South Dearborn Street, the same block where the dome once rose. Steel frame, bronze-tinted glass, black granite plinth. It is a textbook example of Mies van der Rohe's international style, and it is, by the standards of its own ambitions, a successful building. The Kluczynski contains over 1 million square feet of office space. In the plaza between the Kluczynski and the Dirksen Courthouse, Alexander Calder's Flamingo, a 53-foot red steel stybile, was installed in 1974, its curving form standing in deliberate contrast to the straight lines of everything around it. The plaza hosts farmers' markets, protests, federal employees eating lunch on granite benches. The whole complex is now over 50 years old, and it has its own preservation problems. In March 2025, the General Services Administration placed the Kluczynski building on a list of non-core federal properties being considered for sale. The list went up, was trimmed, and was taken down the next day. The Dirksen Courthouse was not on it. The building Mies built to replace what Cobb built is now itself a candidate for disposal, a glass tower that may outlive its usefulness just as the granite dome did before it. Mies van der Rohe died in 1969, 5 years before the Kluczynski building was finished. He never saw the final piece of his federal center completed. Henry Ives Cobb died in 1931, the same year Al Capone was convicted in his building, in New York, far from Chicago. He had already moved his practice to the East Coast years earlier. The Newberry Library still stands. The old Chicago Athletic Association still stands, now a hotel. The University of Chicago campus he master-planned is still in use. The federal building is not. Richard Nickel, the architectural photographer who spent the 1960s documenting Chicago's vanishing landmarks, took photographs of the Cobb building before and during demolition. His images are in the archives of the Art Institute of Chicago. Nickel would die in 1972, crushed by falling debris inside the Chicago Stock Exchange building, another landmark being torn down, this one designed by Louis Sullivan. He was 39 years old. He had spent most of his adult life photographing buildings that no longer exist. The block where the Federal Building stood is now the south half of the Federal Center Plaza. The granite pavers, the open space, the Calder sculpture. Every element lines up on Mies's grid. The columns, the light fixtures, the benches, the granite underfoot, all of it calibrated to a module. The floor surface continues unbroken from exterior to interior. The only difference, a layer of polish on the pavers inside the Kluczynski lobby. More than 1,000 federal employees work in the complex every day. The CTA's blue line runs underneath. There is no plaque on the site marking what was there before. No marker noting the dome or the rotunda or the mosaic floors or the courtroom where Capone was convicted or the lobby where a teenage Walt Disney walked past a bomb. In the northeast corner of what is now Maggie Daley Park, 2 granite columns stand at the entrance of a garden built for cancer survivors. The columns are weathered. They have been in storage, underwater, and now in open air. They face south toward the lake. They are 40 feet tall, and they hold up nothing.